HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Small Wars, Big Data, The Information Revolution in Modern Conflict by Eli Berman, Joseph H. Felter, and Jacob N. Shapiro, with Vestal McIntyre. Read by John Mclain. Preface. Why it is important to read this book now. A drowned boy pulled from the Mediterranean, kidnapped schoolgirls sitting helpless at gunpoint in a field in Nigeria, shoppers lying dead in a market in Iraq, more than 350 killed on a Saturday afternoon in Mogadishu, the Twin Towers spewing smoke as they collapse. These images, now seared in our common experience, reflect the direct and indirect effects of modern wars. The death toll in these small or intrastate wars is staggering. As we go to press, the war in Syria has claimed 400,000 lives in 7 years. The much longer war in Somalia, 500,000. The younger conflict in Yemen, 10,000. Civil wars grind on in Afghanistan and Iraq, while insurgencies continue to claim lives in India, Mali, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, South Sudan, and many other countries around the world. Fatalities tell only part of the story. These conflicts slow economic growth, impoverishing entire generations. The effects on human health are persistent, lasting long after the fighting is ended. When you consider the brutal tactics employed by the self-proclaimed Islamic State, IS, also known as Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, and other combatants in today's conflicts, add the years of misery experienced by refugees and internally displaced people, and include the global terrorism that extends from these local conflicts, making almost all of humanity feel at risk, the burden becomes overwhelming. How do these small wars occur, and what can be done to reduce the damage? A first step is to better understand the inner workings of intrastate warfare. That is our purpose in this book. The logic of these wars is quite different from the mechanisms that drive interstate wars, that is, wars between nations. That matters because the intuitive response to interstate wars often fails when applied to intrastate wars. We will closely consider the differences presently, but first, let's examine how the prevailing form of warfare has changed over the past several decades. The rise of intrastate warfare. The period since the Vietnam War has seen far more civil wars, and they have been far more costly than wars between nations. The number of interstate wars in any year has not exceeded 5 and has hovered close to 0 for the past decade. Meanwhile, the number of intrastate wars peaked at 50 in the early 1990s, subsided to a level roughly equivalent to that in the 1960s, and has risen again since 2005. The character of these intrastate wars has also changed over time. During the Cold War, most were proxy wars between governments and insurgents, each backed by the opposing superpower. Those were extremely violent conflicts, as reflected in the high number of battle deaths. The 1990s saw a peak in the number, but not the lethality of civil wars, characterized by two sides with equivalent and usually low military sophistication. This rise was driven by the civil wars that broke out across Africa over the decade, many of which became long-running conflicts, like the horrible on and off civil war in Liberia, 1989 through 2003, which resulted in the death of 6% of the population and the displacement of 25%. The increase in fatalities since 2005 is fueled almost entirely by the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, with Yemen and Afghanistan each contributing to the toll. Those conflicts are unbalanced, pitting militarily weak insurgents against a government supplied by technologically sophisticated allies. The United States, NATO and other Western powers routinely intervene in such conflicts. While the number of new interventions has varied, around 2 to 3 per year, the right graph indicates that they endure and accumulate as conflicts go unresolved. And many other countries have faced conflicts on their own soil, including India, with the Naxalite conflict in the heart of the country, as well as ethnic separatist movements in its northeastern regions, and Pakistan, which has been fighting militant groups in the federally administered tribal areas since the mid-2000s. Since the 1990s, the United Nations has responded to the increase in civil wars with new peacekeeping missions. Between 1989 and 1994 alone, for example, the UN Security Council authorized 20 new operations, raising the number of peacekeeping troops from 11,000 to 75,000. And those numbers have continued to grow, with more than 112,000 UN personnel deployed around the world as of June 2017. The experience of American troops intervening in places such as Somalia and Yugoslavia in the late 1990s prompted General Charles C. Krulak, then Commandant of the Marine Corps, to theorize about the dramatic change in the type of warfare America was conducting. In one moment in time, our service numbers will be feeding and clothing displaced refugees, providing humanitarian assistance. In the next moment, they will be holding two warring tribes apart, conducting peacekeeping operations, and finally, they will be fighting a highly lethal mid-intensity battle, all on the same day, all within 3 city blocks. It will be what we call the 3-block war. Krulak predicted that demographic shifts and globalization would continue to push different ethnic, class, and nationalist groups crowded together in growing cities to spark conflicts, which would eventually require U.S. intervention. Krulak was prescient about the rise of the 3-block war and the need for outsiders to intervene in civil conflicts with what the U.S. military has called full-spectrum operations. And these are the types of military engagements the West can expect to fight for the foreseeable future, because no non-state threat will be able to challenge Western nations in head-to-head combat for control over territory anytime soon. The gap in weapons and surveillance technology has widened since Krulak wrote. As we write, IS has high-powered assault rifles, commercial drones jury-rigged to drop grenades, guided anti-tank missiles, and no shortage of ammunition. But these systems do not compare to the weapons of the coalition opposing it: air power, GPS-guided munitions, long-range drones carrying precision-guided missiles, and spy satellites. While conventional combat is off the table, guerrilla warfare, as we will see in the coming chapters, remains a viable and sustainable strategy for heavily disadvantaged forces whenever they can depend on the local population for support and protection. Information, and how it is leveraged, we will argue, play a key role in governments' efforts to defeat or contain insurgencies. During the Algerian Civil War, for example, it was the government's ability to use information to infiltrate the Islamist rebellion, as much as its brutal tactics, that led to victory. India and Nepal have both used tips from civilians to contain rural Maoist insurgencies. In the NATO operation in Libya in 2011 and the French-led intervention in Mali in 2013, local information allowed the intervening parties to effectively use their military advantages to target combatants. The global effects of small wars. While it is tempting to think of these wars as a horror that plagues distant places, the effects of today's civil wars are felt far beyond the borders of the countries where they simmer. First of all, they tend to spill over borders to create violence and instability in neighboring nations, the way Boko Haram has in Chad and Cameroon. Second, they can lead to terrorist attacks in faraway nations. The examples of this are clear and numerous, but we can start by thinking of what Paris suffered. hundreds killed in the Mitro bombings of the 1990s at the hands of the Groupe Islamique Armée, GRE, which was waging an insurgency in Algeria, and 130 on the night of 15 November 2015 at the hands of IS. The subnational conflicts, so common in recent years, are particularly potent incubators of terrorism, as they create pockets of poorly governed space where terrorists can organize and train. When space is governed by non-state actors aligned with terrorists, there is no stable entity responsible, so there is no address for punishment or deterrence. Third, insurgencies create opportunities for network building among terrorists, the kind Al-Qaeda fostered and that enabled the planning of the 9/11 attacks. Fourth, ungoverned spaces within sovereign states can breed a range of pernicious threats beyond terrorism, drug trafficking and human trafficking, as in Afghanistan and Mexico, and infectious diseases such as Ebola, which was enabled by the collapse of health services in post-Civil War Liberia. Finally, small wars have the potential to catalyze big wars, as powerful nations intervene on one side or another, and interstate conflict can develop into a multinational conflagration. The current civil war in Yemen, for example, has dramatically escalated the potential for conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For all these reasons, we need a far greater understanding of how insurgencies are sustained, who joins them and why, who funds them, how they interact with the communities in which they hide, and what can be done to defeat them. On the more hopeful side, weakening today's insurgencies would be largely good for democracy worldwide. In 2014, Afghanistan had its first ever peaceful democratic election and transfer of power. In 2015, Nigeria did the same. An increasingly powerful Taliban, or Boko Haram, would threaten these nascent democracies. The fledgling governments of Iraq and Afghanistan are making real efforts at economic development, improving health care, and empowering women. The West can help these governments navigate their minefields, both literal and metaphorical. Persistent intrastate conflict is one of the great scourges of our era. It stymies economic development, directly and indirectly kills hundreds of thousands every year, breeds terrorism, and saps policy attention from other threats, such as climate change. The way to deal with these conflicts is becoming less and less mysterious, though. As we will show in the pages ahead, a broad body of research contains lessons on how to do so. If applying those insights can help open up political space to get deals done, then winning small fights can lead to big gains. We hope this book provides an important step in that direction. 1. Know the war you're in. The first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking. Karl von Clausewitz. It seems unfathomable now, but by directive, at that time we weren't even allowed to use the term insurgency or insurgents, even though everyone knew that's what we were facing every day. It was very frustrating for soldiers operating in these conditions because they rarely saw the enemy, but were constantly reacting to the variety of methods they employed to attack them. This was the reality we were settling into after a month or so on the ground. Colonel Brent Parmiter, U.S. Army retired, on soldiers trained for a big conventional war, finding themselves facing an asymmetric one in Iraq in 2004. 0630 hours, 6 June 2004, Tikrit, Iraq, 1st Infantry Division Headquarters, Forward Operating Base, Danger. Major General Batiste, Commanding General of the U.S. Army 1st Infantry Division, looked with some anticipation into the faces of the 30-odd staff officers and NCOs filing in for the daily division operations update. Fatigue and stress had etched lines onto nearly all, though most were still young. Those nearing the end of a night shift supporting the division's maneuver elements, conducting neighborhood sweeps, manning checkpoints, and other operations could be readily distinguished from those just beginning their day by their weary expressions or by the day's growth of beard on their chins. The room was incongruously grand. Marble floors reflected the light from a crystal chandelier at the center, while Moorish arches opened onto darkened hallways at the periphery. The 1st Division staff occupied the palace where Saddam Hussein and his entourage used to stay when visiting his hometown of Tikrit, one of many such compounds across Iraq. One adaptation the soldiers had made was to erect crude, stadium-style seating in front of a podium and 3 large screens. The smell of fresh-cut plywood still permeated the room. The 1st Division members took their seats, many clutching the ubiquitous plastic water bottles with dust-coated hands. Before them hung blank white screens, and next to them maps of the town, a grid of streets with the dark braid of the Tigris River running from north to south. Operational graphics representing the disposition and location of friendly forces, unit boundaries, and other icons were neatly transcribed in fine-tipped Sharpie onto acetate sheets overlaying the maps. The troops expected the operations update to refer to this geography, but when a map was projected on the screen, it showed the gentle curve where the English Channel meets the coast of France. This operations update was special. Today was 6 June 2004, and the division staff had used computer-aided graphics and satellite imagery to develop an operations update reflecting the 1st Infantry Division's participation in the Allied landings in Normandy, exactly 60 years earlier. 0630 hours, 6 June 1944. H hour, D-Day. 1st Infantry Division, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Machine gun fire ripped across the deck the moment the ramp dropped from the Higgins amphibious assault vehicle. Bullets wounded or killed many of the lead elements of the U.S. Army 1st Infantry Division's invasion force before their boots touched the sand. Soon, Omaha Beach was soaked in blood. German artillery fire rained down on the advancing forces. The soldiers who made it past submerged obstacles and through this gauntlet of fire to reach the crescent-shaped beach had to traverse an additional 300 meters of fire-swept open ground laced with barbed wire and studded with landmines. Only then did they reach the first available cover at the base of the bluffs. A number of the soldiers storming the beach on that historic morning were seasoned veterans of multiple campaigns. The 1st Infantry Division had initially seen combat in North Africa in 1942, then fought in the invasion of Italy in 1943. Given the extraordinary operations tempo the division had maintained and the major battles and campaigns it participated in early in the war, many believed it would be spared assignment to the first wave of Operation Overlord's invasion force. But the senior leaders developing the invasion plans decided to send this seasoned division in with the initial assault on Normandy. The soldiers were not expecting to land unopposed, but still they were shocked to meet with seemingly impenetrable resistance from German defenders securely dug in and well prepared, including the only full-strength enemy infantry division in France. The first day, Allied forces suffered approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing in action, and German forces approximately 9,000, despite their well-prepared and fortified positions. In total, nearly 500,000 combatants would eventually be killed or wounded in the Normandy campaign. The Allied forces who survived the bloody amphibious assault, secured the beachhead, and made their way inland, faced the extraordinary challenge of advancing across occupied France and into the German homeland. Missions of the storied 1st Infantry Division would include employing fire, maneuver, and shock effect to destroy German forces in the field, seize cities and key terrain from German control, and destroy industrial bases and other means of resistance. The ultimate goal of the 1st Division was to secure the unconditional surrender of Hitler's regime, clearly defined, though by no means easy to achieve. Success on the battlefield was a necessary and nearly sufficient condition to achieve ultimate victory over the Axis powers. In this war, state capacity was readily translated into success on the battlefield. Allied forces would eventually prevail because the industrial base of the United States, once mobilized by the fully supportive political leadership and committed American public, enabled them to produce the massive amount of war materiel required to turn the tide. Bombing raids over Germany increased, and Allied infantry forces progressed rapidly across France and into Germany itself. In April 1945, less than 10 months after the assault on the Normandy coast, U.S. and British forces linked up with the Soviet Red Army and secured Germany's unconditional surrender. Major General Batiste turned off the projections and raised the lights. He brought the formal ceremony to its culmination. "Commanders, present your soldiers the shoulder sleeve insignia of the 1st Infantry Division on this day, 60 years after our forefathers landed on the beaches of Normandy." All of the 1st Infantry Division members now carried the striking image of the division's Big Red 1 insignia on both shoulders, the left and now the right. In the U.S. Army, soldiers wear the patch of the current unit on their left shoulder. By tradition, they wear the insignia of units they have served with in combat on their right and are authorized to wear them there for the rest of their time in service. Save for a handful of senior non-commissioned officers and officers who had served in Desert Storm or in the Panama invasion over a decade earlier, this was the first time the division's soldiers earned this privilege and distinction. Major General Batiste recited the 1st Infantry Division's World War I motto: "No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first." This story was told to us by Colonel Brent Parmenter, U.S. Army, retired. At the time, he was Chief of Operations, CHOPS, in charge of a critical section of the 1st Infantry Division operations staff responsible for the current and near-term operations of the division. Among his many duties were morning updates and evening radio net calls to ensure a common understanding of current and future activities among commanders and staff. Prior to deployment, the 1st Division had trained in much the same way that U.S. Army units based in Germany had done throughout the Cold War, maneuvering combat units to engage and destroy a conventional enemy. A number of the division's members were veterans of the First Gulf War. Ground fighting there had lasted just 96 hours and resulted in an overwhelming victory for the U.S. and coalition forces over the Iraqi military. This had seemed a validation of the U.S. military's approach to defeating its foes through technological dominance of the battlefield from air, sea, and land. Aside from the recent peacekeeping missions in Bosnia and Kosovo, the unit had little experience with insurgency. Unfortunately, neither the train-up nor the experience in the First Gulf War did much to prepare the 1st Division's leaders and soldiers for what they found in Iraq: roadside bombs, assassinations of village leaders friendly to the coalition, and the destruction of bridges and other infrastructure. Vehicle-borne explosives starting to pop up, Parmenter explained, and you had small arms fire attacks just randomly through urban areas and landmines placed to hit our forces. Though the 1st was suffering nowhere near the casualties seen on D-Day or throughout World War II, it was not uncommon to experience more than 50 enemy attacks a day across the division's area of operations, and there were casualties every day. These were not clustered around any front. Attacks could happen at any moment, anywhere U.S. forces were deployed across the increasingly restive country. Major General Batiste's purpose in reminding his soldiers of the 1st Division's powerful history at Normandy was to give them an additional source of support and stability to draw on during those challenging times. But his reminder also highlighted what a different tactical challenge the division faced and how, in essence, they were better prepared for battles like Normandy than for Tikrit. In Iraq, the 1st Division soldiers had a steep advantage over the enemy, unprecedented firepower, vehicles, and technology, but they rarely had the opportunity to use these against the elusive and seemingly invisible insurgents. Even the most advanced surveillance systems had a difficult time confirming whether an individual was the enemy and whether the people surrounding him were combatants or civilians. Fortunately, Major General Batiste and most of the senior leaders quickly recognized that this fight was unlike the First Gulf War and more like the small subnational wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, where the U.S. military had played a peacekeeping role. Both the 2nd and 3rd Brigades had spent time in Kosovo, where they had encountered a similar, though much less violent, insurgency. Batiste knew that the 1st Division needed to conduct precision actions, raids, and other operations to find and capture or kill the insurgent groups and individuals responsible for the violence. To do this, they first had to learn to engage with the local population, gain their trust, glean fragments of information from them, and piece these together into a coherent intelligence estimate. Each step in this process represented a major challenge. About a month after the D-Day commemoration, an insurgent dressed in police uniform detonated a car bomb at a building occupied by 1st Division soldiers and Iraqi policemen, killing many of both in Samarra, a city 40 miles from Tikrit. This marked the beginning of a period of intense insurgent activity. Every patrol entering Samarra met some combination of small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, improvised explosive devices, and indirect fire. Later in the summer, the 1st Division and other units pushed into the city and drove out most of the insurgents. Afterward, 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry stayed to conduct hold and build operations, while the other units withdrew. Parmiter described the variety of activities this entailed. On one day, patrolmen would go out and meet with a group of primary school teachers to figure out how we could set up an education program in a town. On the next patrol, 2 hours later, we would try to set up a terrain denial patrol around a known mortar firing location. 2 hours after that, we would go and meet with the mayor and his city infrastructure team, which may or may not even have existed, to try to figure out how we could fix an electrical problem or water problem in the town. And then our last patrol would be to go to secure a police recruiting drive to protect the individuals that might want to sign up to attend a training academy, which we had to set up to be future policemen. All of this was part of Major General Batiste's directive to conduct intelligence-driven operations and protect the population from the insurgents. This made the population more likely to provide information on bad actors when they had it, which helped us interdict planned attacks and successfully target insurgents. The months that followed the initiation of combat operations in Samarra were trying, with numerous attacks suffered and a strong effort by the insurgents to push coalition forces out. Parmiter described their strategy. It was during this stage that every one of the U.S. soldiers in Samarra realized that we gained very little through violence in the form of kinetic responses. They were often the worst response, especially in urban and other areas with a high risk of collateral damage. In fact, we suspected that for every Iraqi killed or injured by U.S. forces, we were essentially creating more new insurgents. On the contrary, for every non-kinetic action where we were assisting the population, like helping with the hospitals, schools, critical infrastructure, and other similar activities, we were taking the power away from the insurgents and encouraging greater support and collaboration from among the population. According to Parmiter, the 1st Infantry Division realized that they were in a war fought for the support and cooperation of the local population, a population who could provide information, completely different from the war their forefathers waged in 19...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?